Okay.
Okay, welcome everyone. We are glad you can join us for this 10 a.m. session sponsored by LERA, Labor and Employment Relations Association. My name is Dania Francis at UMass Boston, and I will chair this session. So first, I'd like to thank LERA for sponsoring this session, and a couple of housekeeping notes. We unfortunately had two papers for very relatable and understandable reasons had to pull their papers. So we have more time for the two that we have remaining, which is great. Okay, so what we will do is, oh, I should probably mention the name of the session: Racial Labor Market Disparities, Automation, Entrepreneurship, Non-Standard Work, and the Pandemic Employment Crisis. And so we'll start with a paper by Rachel Atkins at NYU, discussed by Pat Baer. And then we'll follow that up with a paper by Ofronama, BU, and discussed by Brian Stewart. Okay, so without further ado, I will move myself out of the way and turn it over to Rachel.
Thanks, Mia. Share my slide. You all see that? Yes? Okay. All right. So first, thank you so much to Ofronama for organizing this session, to LERA for hosting this session, and Dania for facilitating our session today. What I'm sharing with you all this morning is very early work, and so I am anxious to get feedback from Pat and others to help the direction. It's primarily descriptive, but eager to sort of push forward and see what else I can do to enhance this work. So it's titled "When Opportunity Doesn't Knock: The Relationship Between Labor Market Opportunity and Necessity Entrepreneurship Among Black Workers." And just some background, say large and enduring disparities in entrepreneurship rates among Black workers are documented in the literature. There is work that suggests that rates of initiating business startup activity are actually higher among Black workers, but due to large barriers to entry, especially lending discrimination, we do observe sort of actual entry rates in many studies that are lower than other groups, and particularly lower than comparison to white workers. And this actually, just some additional background, is coming out of some of my dissertation work, where I was looking at some of the theories related to push and pull factors that contribute to entrepreneurship. And there is a theoretical argument that could be made that we should expect to see higher levels of Black entrepreneurship given labor market disadvantages. So some of the theories that argue that workers who face higher barriers in the labor market often turn to self-employment as an alternative. And so the question that I'm looking to answer in this work is, do racial differences in opportunity and necessity entrepreneurship among Black and white workers explain the incongruence between the theoretical prediction that we should expect to see maybe some higher rates for Black workers and the predominant empirical findings. So what I have found so far: Black workers are more likely to become necessity entrepreneurs, less likely to become opportunity entrepreneurs, and that the disparities in sort of our aggregate rates that we observe are largely driven by deficits in opportunity entrepreneurship. And I think this contributes some to the literature on opportunity and necessity entrepreneurship, the literature on minority entrepreneurship, and that there's more work to be done on understanding opportunity structures. And I'll talk about some of that at the end. And I hope that maybe, since we have time for extended discussion in this session, maybe we could all talk about that a little bit. So just the theoretical framework that I'm pulling from is one that appears prominently in this literature, the Evans and Jovanovic model, which suggests that workers are faced with a choice between self-employment and labor market employment, and they choose essentially the sector that will provide them with the largest earnings. There is a spin-off of this literature that talks a lot about the constraints faced by workers. That's primarily driven by ability to finance their businesses. They argue that entrepreneurs are sort of limited by their wealth and the amount of sorry, I just gotta pop up the screen here. They're limited by their wealth when they're seeking to invest capital in their businesses. And so essentially they put forth a model of earnings in the labor market that are driven by education and by experience. That's here. And then they model earnings in the self-employment sector as a function of entrepreneur ability and the capital that is invested in their businesses. And again, that is sort of limited by personal wealth. And so then recently Fairley and Fawson come along and they sort of have this model of necessity and opportunity entrepreneurship that sort of builds on this theoretical framework. And they essentially argue that the necessity entrepreneurship that we observe comes from this portion here where workers have lower earnings in the labor market, largely driven by unemployment, and that we can understand opportunity entrepreneurs as sort of driven by this self-employment earnings being higher. And so yes, they sort of operationalize necessity entrepreneurship as sort of folks who in the period prior to observing their entry into self-employment, that they were unemployed. And for opportunity entrepreneurs in the period prior to them entering self-employment, they come either from the labor market or they were students or they were outside of the labor market. Excuse me, they were employed out of the labor market or they were students. And so for entrepreneurs who they classify as opportunity entrepreneurs, there wouldn't necessarily, I think, be a direct relationship between, say, unemployment status, but there might be some indirect relationship between unemployment rates and opportunity entrepreneurship in the sense that perhaps, high unemployment reduces overall earnings, and so maybe consumer demand is down, and so we would maybe expect to see a negative relationship between unemployment and opportunity entrepreneurship in that regard, but that would be more of an indirect. And so, we have ample evidence that as unemployment rates rise, Black workers tend to be disproportionately negatively affected. And so building off of Fairley and Fawson's framework, I would hypothesize then that during times of higher unemployment, we would see lower earnings for Blacks than whites and potentially higher rates of necessity entrepreneurship for Black workers than white workers. And then assuming these sort of potential indirect effects, assuming again, Black workers may experience higher rates of unemployment, may face lower levels of earnings from the labor market, and then assuming that Black firms would service Black consumers disproportionately, that sort of indirect effect of unemployment on opportunity entrepreneurship would mean that we would observe potentially lower rates of opportunity entrepreneurship among Black than white workers. So what I use is data from the panel study of income dynamics, biannual longitudinal survey that's used in entrepreneurship studies, particularly those that are interested in looking at Black entrepreneurs in part because this particular survey oversampled Black households. So there's a large enough sample size to evaluate. And so here I follow Fairley and Fawson. I use primarily for this analysis, I use self-employment. One of my sort of extensions, I want to sort of look at some other potential measures of self-employment, plus some of the other variables in the data, such as business assets and some other things. That's not going to be in what I show you here today, though. So my sample is just Black and white non-business owners in the initial period. I have removed folks from other racial and ethnic groups from the sample, and I pull unemployment rate data from Bureau of Labor Statistics. So again, following Fairley and Fawce's definition, necessity entrepreneurs are folks who in year T self-identify as being unemployed. And then in the subsequent survey year, that would be year T+2, they've identified themselves as being self-employed. So initially unemployed, and then enter self-employment by the next survey year. And for opportunity entrepreneurs, essentially it's anyone who is not initially unemployed, and then in the following survey year identifies themselves as being self-employed. So my sample of all the folks who identify as entering into self-employment in a given year, the necessity entrepreneurs account for about 13%, while the opportunity entrepreneurs account for 87%, but we see very high differences by race. So about 23% of the necessity entrepreneurs, of all Black self-employed fall into this, newly self-employed. So I'm only capturing people who enter, not people who sort of already were in over a number of years. So of people who newly enter self-employment, 23% of those Black workers who enter self-employment are necessity category. Only less than 8% of white workers who enter self-employment fall into this necessity category. It's quite a disparity. Okay, so here I have a chart of so this is in orange here. These are the unemployed workers in the PSID data. So my sample of folks who were not already self-employed. In the PSID, these are the unemployed workers in orange. And this chart is all white workers. All entrepreneurs, so all of the people who flipped to becoming self-employed in that year are here in gray. The blue is the share of those workers who are opportunity entrepreneurs. The yellow is the share that are necessity entrepreneurs. And you can see here that it does kind of track, not so much in this period during the recession, but it tracks pretty well with unemployment. And you see that the vast majority were white workers of entrepreneurs here are opportunity entrepreneurs. It's less than 1% for each of the survey years fall into this necessity category. Okay, and then here, figure 2, obviously the scaling is a little bit different than the prior because the higher unemployment rates, but this is for Black respondents in the PSID. Unemployment, again, is in orange here. We see much higher rates of unemployment over the course of the study period. Again, the years here are 1999 to 2017. I'm not sure if I said that earlier. And here we do see overall slightly lower rates of entrepreneurship, but among entrepreneurs, sort of the share, especially here in these later years post-Great Recession, that are necessity entrepreneurs is much higher. In 2011, I believe it close to a third of all of the self-employed were in this necessity category. So we see a very different composition of the entrepreneurs by race over time. And so this is the state unemployment rate on this x-axis here. And so by unemployment rate at the state level category here, and then the share of all entrepreneurs within a racial group that are necessity entrepreneurs is the y-axis. And so as one might expect, there is sort of a positive relationship for the most part between state unemployment rate and the share of entrepreneurs that are necessity entrepreneurs, although it does appear to have this sort of curved feature here. So for white workers, when state unemployment rate gets sort of above that 6% threshold, it kind of starts to decline a bit. And then for Black workers, it sort of goes down after we reach this 10% threshold. So this is something I'm interested in exploring a little bit more, but we'll talk about that later. Okay, and just so some summary statistics here. Not sure how I'm doing on time, but
You're fine.
Okay. Differences in the share unemployed, as we've already seen. Some differences in education and other demographics. And so this is sort of motivating the necessity to do some regressions that sort of account for all these differences in the characteristics of the sample across race. So what I'm going to do is pretty straightforward. Descriptively here, I'm going to look at this question of whether unemployment rates are going to produce higher rates of entrepreneurship for Black and white workers. So I'm going to use both sort of separately look at necessity and opportunity entrepreneurship as the dependent variable, and then the unemployment rate at the state level, dichotomous variable for race, a number of characteristics that were in these summary statistic table, education, age, etc. And the thing that I am most curious about is this interaction between race and the state level unemployment rate. And so again, I'm looking at all of these characteristics on the right-hand side in year T to see if any of these are related to the probability of starting a business in either that necessity or opportunity category in year T plus 2. And I use state and year fixed effects clustered at the state level. Okay, so here is the probability of opportunity entrepreneurship. So in the first column, I'm just looking at the relationship between state unemployment rate and it's not statistically significant, although it's positive here. And in this second column, so it's positive but not significant. So it's sort of in line with what is expected. I don't expect unemployment to really be associated with opportunity entrepreneurship. So in column 2, I add race in, and we see a negative and significant coefficient on Black. So our, as sort of expected, Black workers were less likely to be opportunity entrepreneurs than white workers, even with all controls in there. And then here, looking to see if there's a difference in how unemployment impacts Black and white workers as far as their likelihood of becoming opportunity entrepreneurs. Again, we don't really see anything here. We don't expect unemployment rates to alter opportunity entrepreneurship necessarily, at least not directly. Then looking at necessity entrepreneurship, here we do see, although it's at the 10% level of significance, we do see a positive relationship between unemployment rates at the state level and and necessity entrepreneurship, that's as expected. We add the race variable in, it is still positive. And we see sort of this positive association with Black and necessity entrepreneurship. So that is, again, what we would expect to see. Interestingly here, when we allow the effect of unemployment rates by race to vary by, unemployment rates to vary by race, the coefficients on unemployment and race are no longer significant. And we do see this sort of positive and significant effect of unemployment rates on Black workers. So, you know, that suggests to me that this is being driven a lot by Black workers as opposed to white workers. So again, these are sort of the beginning of my findings. Sort of everything appears as expected. Black workers are more likely to engage in necessity entrepreneurship, less likely to become opportunity entrepreneurs. It appears that, you know, the large difference in opportunity as opposed to necessity entrepreneurship in terms of just the composition of entrepreneurs is sort of driving what we observe in aggregate when we're looking at differences by race. A lot of implications, I think, and opportunities for future work. How we think about entrepreneurship, I think this nuance of, you know, if rates are disproportionately high in necessity entrepreneurship for Black workers, what does it mean for us to be sort of looking for policies and so on that enhance entrepreneurship generally without sort of making these distinctions between type of entrepreneur. More to know about the nature of entrepreneurship from unemployment, whether or not there might be some connections with reduced access to financial capital. So there's a whole literature on disparities and discrimination, quite frankly, in access to financial capital. But you know, does unemployment status at the time that one is seeking that financial capital alter the likelihood of gaining capital, and do lenders treat unemployed workers differently by race? So maybe it matters more, you know, for Black workers than other folks if they're unemployed as far as their chances of getting financing. And then finally, do greater labor market opportunities facilitate opportunity entrepreneurship? So should we be thinking about strategies that strengthen labor markets overall in order to foster opportunity entrepreneurship? So thank you, and I look forward to comments and questions.
Excellent, thank you. I will hand it over to Brian. Oh, sorry, this is Pat, right? Yeah, sorry. Hi, Pat. Thank you.
Yeah, so thanks. Yeah, thanks to inviting me to be part of this session. It's really great to be here this morning. The you know, as Rachel laid out, this is really more of a kind of the beginnings of a research agenda that I think than a paper so far, and I think it's extremely promising. In many ways, what you're seeing here is just like a proof of concept, or, you know, kind of the tip of the iceberg, I think. You know, at the heart of the way she's thinking about entrepreneurship here is that, you know, when we think about it, you know, a lot of the literature treats it as kind of a very homogeneous kind of way of representing entrepreneurship. But, you know, when you really think carefully about it, you know, you think about who is drawn into entrepreneurship, self-employment, you know, then the circumstances under which they're drawn into it. There's an incredible amount of heterogeneity, which then might influence a wide variety of things. So it might influence, you know, outcome. So it might influence, you know, how much innovation occurs, but it also may influence access to inputs, access to capital, to networks, the time that people have to put into it. It might influence their innovative processes themselves. And so there's a lot to dig into here, you know, about the kind of circumstances drawing people in, what it means to be an entrepreneur in different types of economic circumstances, and then ultimately to outcomes. And, you know, I think this conceptual separation that follows from the previous literature, you know, motivating this kind of opportunity versus necessity entrepreneurship is really intuitive. And I think it's a really straightforward and kind of, you know, kind of way to, there's a lot of heterogeneity even under that surface, but it's a way to kind of start to get a handle on what's happening. And you can see from some of the descriptive statistics, just the the differences that are out there. The the heart of Rachel's insight relative to the previous literature is that these kind of conceptual separation into necessity and opportunity entrepreneurship is likely especially important for understanding the nature of Black entrepreneurship in particular, and then also as a result for helping us to make sense of some of the racial differences we see in both the nature and outcomes of entrepreneurship by race in the literature to date. What Rachel is presenting here is largely descriptive statistics on who's drawn into it and what are the circumstances. But I think she makes an excellent case here for how important this is substantively, and therefore, as you look forward, there's a lot to dig into. So, I think that to me, where I see the kind of project as extremely promising is that I think there ultimately are many ways to leverage spatial and temporal variation in both economic shocks and policy changes to really try to generate exogenous variation in the circumstances that would kind of shock people one way or the other. So bring people into necessity entrepreneurship or into opportunity entrepreneurship. I think the real challenge here, and maybe folks in this session will have other ideas. The challenge I think is that to get to that granularity of data that kind of allows the kind of, because I think in many ways I wouldn't be surprised if these measures where we're using the PSID, where you have to lag to look at unemployment 2 years ago, are really vastly understating the amount of necessity entrepreneurship, because it's really somebody might, whether somebody was employed at a particular date 2 years ago versus say had any kind of recent unemployment spell, is likely kind of going to really understate the amount of this kind of necessity unemployment. So having and data sources here are challenging, so I think that would be kind of a good thing to discuss more broadly. But if you imagine having really fine spatial geography and really fine temporal kind of longitudinal data on individuals, I think we both get kind of clearer measures, more precise measures, and in likely much higher measures of necessity entrepreneurship, and then also be able to link it to the kinds of both spatial shocks and kind of both economic shocks, but then kind of linking to some of Rachel's previous work, the opportunity zones and other types of policy variation that might create kind of different economic circumstances to be working in. So that's where I would see the biggest potential for this project, is really to try to get that more granular data and then to be able to use those types of shocks. I think the regressions here, as Rachel laid them out, do link the kind of entrepreneurship entry kind of 2 years later to the previous unemployment shock. I was wondering, Rachel, if your figures are doing it at whether both are at time T, or if one's at, so the figures, some of the high unemployment rate figures, where you get this kind of weird result that you get lower. It seems like sometimes, like given the definition requires the unemployment to have occurred 2 years previously, I was wondering if some of your measures are just need to be using lagged unemployment instead of the concurrent unemployment. So that's just one kind of aside. But I think, overall, I think this is maybe challenging to get at in the data, but I think the proof of concept here is really strong. And I think this is an aspect of entrepreneurship that's gone, way understudied and way underappreciated. So I think if you're able to kind of really see what's going on and then link that to the kind of shocks that are occurring, or variation that you can exploit, I think you can really do some excellent work here and shed light on issues that our current understanding is very limited. So let me stop there and let things open up to a broader discussion.
Excellent. Thank you, Pat. Rachel, did you want to take any moment to respond, or?
No, thank you for your comments, Pat. I think you're right about the opportunities for thinking about other shocks, or thinking about shocks that I could look at. One of the things that is slowing me down, I have access to the confidential microdata. I've had difficulty merging my data in with it. It's very confusing to me. Anybody out there who's worked with the PSID confidential data, please message me. So yeah, so one thing in here, it's not terribly granular because it's just the state. All I have is the state level data from the public data source. To your other question, comment about unemployment, I do lag the unemployment, both the unemployment rates and the unemployment status of the person. I'm not sure if that was what you were getting at. So all of everything on the right hand side is like T, and then my outcome variable is T plus 2.
Yeah, no, for the regressions, that was clear. I was just wondering for the figures.
Oh,
because that might explain some of the funniness where like the necessity entrepreneurship only shows up kind of like a little bit after the Great Recession, and then anyway, I thought maybe that was just
I see what you're saying. I need to think about what I did there. Yes, thank you. That was all. Thanks.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, so I think we will go with this second paper, and then do all discussion at the end. Okay, so I will now turn it over to Ofronama. There you are. And
thanks, everyone. Thanks for joining. So my presentation is on Black women, Black men, and occupational crowding and non-standard arrangements. So to start, I will talk about some background on what we know about employment in the US. So because of the lack of a social safety net in this country, workers rely on jobs for many benefits, yet many workers who are in lower paying positions are locked out of receiving many amenities. Then things can be even more challenging for people who are in various forms of non-standard work. So workers in some alternative arrangements have less stability or paid less and have fewer benefits. And then let's look at what we know about Black workers. Even the ones who are highly educated are worse off than their white counterparts, with unemployment that's 2 times higher and overrepresentation in low-wage occupations. What I want to know about is how Black workers by race and gender are sorted into work as non-standard when we take education into account. So many workers lack permanent, stable, or formal employment, and this alternative work comes with a lack of legal protections, including missing payments, lack of paid leave, lack of clarity on who is the employer of record when there are concerns about discrimination and harassment. We also know that wages are an issue. So what I'm showing are contract workers, temp agency workers, on-call workers, independent contractors. These are all forms of alternative work, and also traditional workers. So independent contractors using data from the Contingent Worker Survey. These are people who are independent consultants, independent contractors, or freelance workers, self-employed or otherwise. Contract workers are those who are employed by a company that provides them or their services to another company, usually under contract. And temp help agency workers are paid by a temp help agency, whether or not their occupation is temporary. And then finally, on-call workers are called to work as needed, although it could be scheduled for a couple of days or even a few weeks. So here I'm looking at the median weekly wages among full-time workers using the Contingent Worker Survey. And interestingly, contract workers on average earn more than traditional workers. Independent contractor wages are pretty similar to those in traditional arrangements, while workers who are in temp agencies earn the least, $521 a week, compared to $884 for traditional workers. Those in alternative arrangements are also less likely to have health insurance provided by employer, especially temp agency workers, where just 13% report health insurance provided by employer. Of course, independent contractors are self-employed, so they wouldn't qualify, so that information is blank. Contract workers, when it comes to employer health insurance, are somewhat better off, with 41% having this benefit, followed by less than a third of on-call workers. You also see differences in retirement benefits from an employer in alternative work. Workers in traditional arrangements are most likely to be eligible for an employer-sponsored retirement plan, Still very few, just 46%, but just 7% of temp agency workers have employer retirement. Workers provided by contract firms are in a somewhat better position, with almost half eligible for these plans at 38% included. So that's a background on alternative work. So I'll get into Black workers in the economy and what we know about vulnerability. As I mentioned earlier, Black workers are usually 2 times more likely to be unemployed than white workers. Black workers have historically been paid less than white workers, even in the same occupations. And while the household income for white and Black households, at least for Black households, has increased, the differences between white and Black households has not changed substantially since the 1970s. So human capital is usually used to explain disparities in the labor market. It's the distribution of educational attainment in the labor market among Black workers that explains their higher unemployment, lower wages. However, it's important to look at differences within educational groups. So for instance, we found that Black professional class workers see their wages take a more substantial hit during recessions, even more so than the working class when compared to white workers. When it comes to occupational sorting, we know that Black workers are crowded into lower wage positions and crowded out of higher wage ones, even when taking education into account. And that's the occupational crowding theory that I'll be using today. And some previous work on this phenomenon with my colleagues, Chris Famigetti and Derek Hamilton, looking at occupational crowding in Mississippi, we found occupational sorting among Black women in relation to white men, where they were crowded into lower wage occupations, even when taking education into account. So for me, I got curious about how Black workers fare aside from wages when we think about alternative work. When we think about alternative work, we also notice there are some differences in those median weekly wages that I showed you by race, and there wasn't enough data here for me to break it out by gender. So in traditional arrangements, in the contingent worker survey, white workers earn 31% more than Black workers. What's interesting is that the differences are larger in some of the alternative arrangements. So for example, white contract workers, the first set of bars earn 51% more than Black contract workers. Among independent contractors, white workers earn 36% more. However, with temp agencies, wages are virtually the same, low and virtually the same, $511 for white workers and $520 for Black workers. Let's see. So my research question for today is, since we know there are differences in wages among Black and white workers in alternative work, what I want to delve into further is how Black women, Black men, white women, and white men are sorted into alternative work arrangements when we take educational attainment and educational requirements into account. So past occupational crowding research has compared Black men to white men. I'm using the analysis that was done in the study I worked on in Mississippi, but going even further. So in this study, reflecting on Mary King's access model that puts forth a social hierarchy where white men have the most access to desirable jobs, I compare Black women and Black men and white women to white men. As Black women have multiple identities, I also compare Black women to white women and to Black men. And when focusing on white men, I'm comparing them to a baseline of all workers in the economy, not just Black, but to every group to measure their degree of advantage in the economy overall. So to give you a preview of some of the findings, Black women as compared to white men are crowded into roles that have more temp agency workers and crowded out of roles with more independent contractors and contract workers. Black men as compared to white men are crowded into roles with more temp agency workers. White women as compared to white men are crowded out of roles with more contract workers. As I mentioned, contract work generally pays more than these other arrangements and could even pay more than traditional arrangements. And white men as compared to all workers are crowded out of roles with more temp agency workers and crowded into roles with more contract workers. So this research provides several contributions to the literature. I'll hone in on two. One is that this is an opportunity to link the occupational crowding literature to employment vulnerability literature when it comes to alternative work. It's also advantageous to look at multiple racial and gender comparisons and having this intersectional focus. So I'll get into the methodology. So the Occupational Crowding Index is shown here and developed by Barbara Berkman, measures the degree to which workers are over, under, or proportionally represented in an occupation. The index is derived by dividing the actual share of the race and gender group in an occupation by their expected share. This research uses an update to Berkman's method that more explicitly controls for education by limiting the pool of eligible workers for a particular form of work to those with the prerequisite degree attainment. Occupations supposed of more than 10% of the expected number of the group are considered to be cases of overrepresentation. So that crowd index would be more than 1.1. While occupations where less than 10% of the expected number of the relevant group, that would be considered cases of underrepresentation. So that would be a crowd score less than 0.9. And where the expected number of the relevant group doesn't exceed nor is less than 10%, so a crowd index of between 0.9 and 1.1, we consider that proportionally represented. So to show an example of how this works, this is home health aides, which is an occupation that pays less than $25,000. Less than half have employer-sponsored health insurance, and just a quarter have employer retirement. The actual share of Black women as compared to white men, this occupation is 87%. That's based on the expected education and their educational attainment. That's the actual share is 87%, but their expected share is just 17%. So if Black women are proportionally represented in this occupation, that crowd index would be between 0.9 and 1.1. However, here it's 5.0, which indicates Black women are 400% more likely to be home health aides than white men. Contrast, white men are very much underrepresented. You see the crowd index is just 0.14 rather than a proportional range of 0.9 to 1.1. So there are two ways that I looked at the relationship between crowding and alternative work. So for this presentation, I'm going to focus on one analysis, but I'll mention the other one at the end. So what I'm going to do is compute crowding for each race and gender group in each occupation, just as you saw before, as I did with home health aides. So I'm interested in knowing the relationship between the shares of workers in a given role who are in one of these alternative arrangements and crowding. So what I'm going to do is use a CPS contingent worker survey to see what share of a given occupation is composed of people who are, say, temp agency workers. I'm going to crosswalk the CPS occupation codes to ACS and use that ACS crowding score since it's a much bigger sample size. What I'm going to do next to look at the relationship between crowding and the representation of various alternative workers is to do something that's similar to the work and the research that's been done before to demonstrate that there's a relationship between crowding and wages. So as I mentioned before, researchers found that as wages increase in various occupations, the representation of Black men falls by a certain percentage. And when we did this work in Mississippi, we found the same for Black women as compared to white men. So using that idea, I'm going to do this something similar where I'm looking at the share of workers in each arrangement and seeing the relationship between the crowd index. So for example, I want to know the relationship between the crowd score for Black women as compared to white men in occupations and the share of workers in that occupation who are temps. So as occupations become more temp heavy, how does the representation of Black women look? So I'll show some of these results. So let's start with contract workers who on average, as I mentioned before, are paid more than these other alternative arrangements and even more than traditional workers. So calculating the regression of shares of workers in contract work arrangements on crowding reveals that for Black women and white women in comparison to white men, crowding decreases as the occupation has more shares of contract workers, and these findings are statistically significant. For Black men as compared to white men, crowding also decreases as the share of contract workers in an occupation rises, but the findings weren't significant. White men are the only group for whom crowding increases as occupations become more concentrated with contract workers, and this relationship was significant. For Black women as compared to Black men, also found a negative and significant relationship between crowding and contract workers. For white women as well, the relationship between the share of contract workers and crowding was negative and significant. Next is independent contractors who are not paid as much as those in traditional arrangements on average, but the weekly wages are the second highest behind contract work. What's interesting about this arrangement is that the vast majority of independent contractors in the contingent worker survey, they were asked, would you prefer to work for an employer or would you want to continue working for yourself? And most preferred to work for themselves. And I didn't see a significant relationship between the preferences among Black women, Black men, and white men. So the Russian results show a negative and significant relationship between the shares of workers who are independent contractors and crowding. In this instance, for Black women as compared to all three groups. So for Black women as compared to white men, Black men, and white women. For the other groups, for Black men and white women as compared to white men, there's a negative relationship, though it wasn't significant. For white men, there's a positive relationship between the shares of workers who are independent contractors and crowding, though it was not significant. Next is temp agency workers. This is the arrangement that pays the least. And these workers, among the alternative work arrangements, would be qualified or the least likely to have health insurance and tend to have very low wages. So looking at the regressions of crowding and the shares of workers and temp agency arrangements shows a positive relationship between these two things for Black women as compared to white men and as compared to white women. So that means that as occupations have more temp workers, the representation of Black women increases. The same was found for the relationship for Black men as compared to white men. And white men are the only group for whom the relationship between temp agency workers and occupations and crowding decreases, and this was statistically significant. And then lastly, on-call or day workers. There weren't really statistically significant results, with the exception of one thing, which was for Black women as compared to Black men, as the representation of on-call or day workers increases, there's actually fewer Black women in an occupation. So to summarize my findings, what I found was that for Black women and Black men compared to white men, we see crowding into really one of what you could argue is the worst alternative arrangement, which is temp work, just based on what we know about wages and benefits. And we also know that generally people who don't have permanent arrangements prefer something more stable. Results for Black women really do vary based on the comparison group. And we do find that Black women and white women are crowded out of contract work as compared to white men. And for Black women, this also repeats compared to Black men. And we find that white men as compared to all workers are crowded into contract work. So of course, there's some limitations to this analysis. Contingent worker survey, this is what I'm using to find the shares of workers who are in various arrangements in various occupations. It's a much smaller sample, but it is what's available. And some researchers believe that this survey underestimates how many workers are in alternative and contingent arrangements. And also I'll jump to the third, which is that it doesn't also account for electronically mediated work. This is something that the contingent worker survey aimed to analyze. So people who work for companies like Uber, Lyft, or TaskRabbit, but the questions that were included didn't accurately, as they say, capture those workers. So we know that there's a lot of legislation that's happened about classification of these workers as contractors, which locks them out of benefits and pay. So it's important to look at that when there's better data in the future. The other thing I'll mention is a limitation is that I'm looking at the representation of workers in various arrangements. I'm regressing the shares of workers who are, say, for example, temp agency workers on the crowd index. But just because an occupation has a lot of temp agency workers, it doesn't mean that Black women and Black men are necessarily overrepresented in those roles. It could just be that there's overlap between a low wage occupation and that which has a lot of temp workers. So I did conduct another analysis, which I'm not showing here, to address this issue. So what I did was I created two categories of work using the contingent worker survey. So I looked at contract workers versus non-contract workers, for example, temp agency workers versus not temp. And I used I analyzed crowding using that for each race and gender group. And I would say that the findings were pretty similar for the most part. So for example, Black women and Black men are overrepresented in temp agency roles. So when I created that as an occupation as compared to white men, and Black women were underrepresented as both contract workers and independent contractors as compared to white men. White women were underrepresented as contract workers as compared to white men again. Same result for white men being underrepresented as temp agency workers. And while white men were overrepresented roles with more contract workers in the analysis I showed you today, in the secondary work, they were proportional contract work, but overrepresented as independent contractors. So that's something that I'm interested in looking at a little bit further. So some policy recommendations, I mean, there's several that come to mind. I'll mention a couple here. One, of course, would have to do with legal oversight. There's really not much going on to protect temp agency workers. And, there's research that's shown that even within temp agency workers, you see Black workers being assigned to more dangerous assignments. So there needs to be better policies to protect people who are temps. And there also needs to be more legal oversight to begin with for EOC addressing discrimination that might mean that people are forced to pursue these temp jobs because they can't get something more permanent. I would also mention, of course, the need for more data on workers in these various arrangements with larger sample sizes and better questions, and also questions about why people have these preferences for independent work. I would also add that people have been advocating for a federal jobs guarantee, which would be a prospective policy to provide a stable job and a well-paid job and one with benefits to anyone who wants one. It would help to reemploy workers who've lost their jobs or don't want the undesirable jobs that they have during this pandemic, and ensure that they're less vulnerable to labor market discrimination. So I'll end it there and happy to receive some feedback.
Excellent. Thank you. Very interesting work. Brian.
All right. Can you all see my screen okay? Great. So thanks very much. I'm really happy to be here and for the opportunity to read and think about Ofronama's work. Just a really quick recap, because I think that presentation was super clear. I see the main question here as being about whether or not Black women and men are disproportionately concentrated in occupations that have a higher share of alternative work arrangements. Where really key to the argument of this paper is that disproportionately means beyond what we would predict based on educational attainment, the educational attainment that workers have, and the sorting that we see of different educated workers across occupations. Now, I think a major strength of the paper is the nuance of the results and kind of the careful consideration of those. As a discussant, I'll take the liberty to maybe generalize a bit. I think the two results that really stood out to me are, first of all, that Black workers are overrepresented in occupations that are less desirable, as stated by workers, and also that are less remunerative, those occupations where people get paid less. And so you can see this as basically the crowding out of independent contract work and the crowding into temp work, for example. And moreover, this is not just kind of a story about differences between Black and white workers, but there are differences between Black women and Black men as well, in the sense that Black women are also overrepresented in these occupations. And so, the comments that I'll offer today is, I think, first of all, I really, really like this work. These are important results. I find the paper really convincing. It's put together very well. I think for me, one of the reasons why these results are so important is just because work arrangements matter so much, right? So not only do they affect individuals' earnings, which then affects a lot of the other opportunities that they have available to them, but work arrangements influence people's quality of life, their ability to be with their family, certainly affects future career opportunities. And so when you think about long-term trajectories, All of these things are really important. I think a major strength of this paper is the disaggregation by race and sex, and importantly, type of alternative work arrangement, right? There are major differences between temp workers and independent contractors, for example. And a lot of the insights that we get out of this paper come from that disaggregation. In the background here is this question about kind of understanding labor market discrimination. And so the paper talks about some other work using, for example, audit studies or resume audits. And I think this is a really nice complement to that literature and helping us kind of understand the nuances of labor market discrimination and how that plays out for individuals. So given all of the great things about this paper, my job as a discussant is somewhat difficult, but I'm going to make two suggestions. The first one is going to be kind of an alternative estimation approach that I think could complement the current paper's focus on the crowding index. And then I'll conclude with just some other questions of interest that I think don't necessarily belong in this paper, but I hope Ofronama or someone else will kind of think about it in the future. Okay, so the first comment that I have is in no way kind of a criticism of this paper's approach. It's about thinking about a complementary approach. And so what the paper does is measure an occupational crowding index. And that crowding index will tell us whether or not a specific type of worker is over or underrepresented in an occupation, holding fixed some notion of educational requirements. And in particular, the kind of definition of what a qualified worker is in this paper is that an individual is deemed to be qualified for an occupation if their level of schooling falls between the 20th and 80th percentiles of the occupation's overall education distribution. And so that's going to capture the fact that chemists have higher levels of education than carpenters, for example. And that's, I think, a really sensible way to address the role of educational requirements. So I kind of don't have any complaints with that. However, this is really important because, as Ofronama's presentation made clear, one of the questions we're after here is how much of this crowding is driven by differences in schooling versus differences in discrimination. And so I think given the importance of that story, what I'm going to suggest is a way to maybe even further address the degree to which this is not driven by human capital differences. And so what I'm going to suggest is a regression here. And the regression is going to have a lot of similar features. It'll be based on the same data that was used and using pretty similar measures. But so I'll just walk through this. The idea is for each occupation, we can calculate something like the share of workers in that occupation that have some type of alternative arrangement. So you could look within chemists and ask what share of chemists are temp workers, for example, and do the same thing for carpenters. That's on the left-hand side of the regression, where that comes from the contingent worker survey that Ofronama is already using. And then the idea on the right-hand side is we're most interested in these race by sex combinations, right? So when we want to compare Black women to white men or Black women to Black men, for example. And the value of kind of setting this up as a regression is that it becomes very easy to control for whatever proxies we think might pick up human capital differences or differences in workers' desire for different types of work arrangements. So instead of just kind of looking at whether or not somebody falls within the 20th to 80th percentiles of the education distribution, we could include kind of full indicator variables for every year of education that somebody has. And we can include flexible controls for individuals' age. I also think there might be some differences by the state where individuals reside. And you can think about family status as maybe affecting workers' desire for different work arrangements and their desire for different types of flexibility. Now, I think the goal here, obviously with these controls, you have to think carefully, and I know that Ofronama would do that. You don't want to control for kind of too much in this regression, but in focusing on how much of this is about human capital versus discrimination, I think these two controls at least feel pretty good to me as kind of ruling out that story. Now, I think the benefit is that we get more flexible regression controls here. The clear cost, I think, is that this doesn't directly tie to the crowding index literature. And I think that's a real strength of the paper, is kind of pushing the crowding index into this domain. But I think given that for the most part, the paper is really interested just in these differences in occupational sorting by race and sex, that struck me as kind of a cost that we might be worth willing to accept as kind of a complementary approach to what's in the paper. Where again, the hope is that this allows us to kind of further rule out differences in human capital and things like that. So that's kind of comment one, just a complementary approach. My second comment was just in thinking about like, what questions are we interested in this space? And so what this paper does is to classify occupations based on the incidence of alternative work arrangements, and then look at the relative propensity of different types of workers to be in those types of occupations. Previous work that Ofronama discusses in the paper has looked at occupations classified by wages. So are they high wage or low wage, things like that. And I know other work by Ofronama has looked at occupations' propensity to offer health insurance or retirement benefits. And I would say all of this is great. You know, I think occupations make a lot of sense for how we think about the labor market, and these dimensions are really valuable. And I think there are also a lot of other interesting questions that kind of don't condition on occupation. So one kind of very simple question is just whether or not Black women and men are more likely to work in certain alternative work arrangements. Now, Ofronama, the paper answers that question because there are clear summary statistics. And I just want to stress that I think that unconditional gap is really important as well as we think about racial disparities in the labor market. And I could see a case why you might want to answer this question while holding constant or trying to fix in some degree differences in education or age or the other variables that we just talked about. Where the basic point is that these questions are not about the occupation where individuals work. So independent of the occupation where somebody works, we can be interested in differences in alternative work arrangements because those work arrangements are so important for individuals' careers and their quality of life. And so, you know, I'm kind of a simple person, and so this is a simple question that can be answered instead of using occupational measures of alternative arrangements. You can just use individual level alternative arrangements. So this is the type of regression that could be looked at just with a contingent worker survey, for example. You know, the big cost there is you have a smaller sample size relative to the American Community Survey. But I think for the limited sets of parameters that we're interested in, you might still be able to get some more out of that. So I would just say as this literature evolves, I think it's important to think about dimensions that don't condition on occupation as well. So let me just wrap up. Jobs matter a bunch. That's, I think, not news to anybody here. In particular, though, they matter because these differences in job characteristics provide us with more nuance on the extent of labor market inequality, and they're certainly going to inform policy responses, as Ofronama alluded to towards the end. And I really like this paper because it helps improve our understanding of these issues. And I know that Ofronama has other work going on, which will push this literature even further. So thanks very much.
Excellent. Thank you, Brian. Ofronama, do you want to take any moment to respond?
No, that was very helpful. Thank you.
Excellent. So thank you to both our paper presenters and discussants. So we can open up to broader discussion with the participants, and it looks like we have the luxury of not being in a webinar type situation here. So participants can, you know, raise your hand digitally, or just, you know, kind of unmute and speak, and also use the chat feature if you cannot unmute and speak. Okay, Brian, you have your hand up.
Yeah, great. I had a few comments or questions for Rachel. I really enjoyed that presentation as well. And Rachel, one of the things that I was thinking through, so the characterization of necessity versus opportunity entrepreneurship, I agree with you and with Pat that that's like a really helpful way to think about that question. The challenge when we take that to regressions seems to be that if you think like the business cycle affects differently whether a Black or a white worker loses their job, then when our measure of entrepreneurship kind of reflects that past experience, I found it a little bit difficult to think through some of those regressions and how much is driven by just the differential sensitivity of employment to the business cycle versus workers' desire to go into different types of self-employment. The other, I think, issue is, if you think about like what would you have to do to get into the ACS or bigger data sets to analyze some of the questions that Pat highlighted and that you talked about as well. So one of the ideas that I had was whether or not you could use the PSID to basically figure out whether or not this opportunity versus necessity entrepreneurship, could we just characterize that based on how much money people make when they're self-employed? So, a different way you could think about this question is just a necessity entrepreneur might be somebody who, say, is self-employed and has especially low earnings. An opportunity entrepreneur is somebody who's self-employed and has especially high earnings. Now that misses, I think, a lot of the nuance that you're talking about with the push factor into self-employment. But I could see for some cases that we're interested in that notion of self-employment or entrepreneurship as well. And that has the benefit of not conditioning on kind of previous transitions out of the labor market. And so one thing I thought might be interesting is whether or not with the PSID, you could just, do like, and maybe you've done this, but a deep dive into who are these types of self-employed workers, and can we characterize based on like the industry where they work or the occupation that they report or their amount of earnings. Getting those kinds of measures might open up new channels of analysis. And again, I think it in no way replaces the framework that you've set up, but I'm just trying to think, are there proxies that can kind of get you into bigger data sets?
What Frank has to say about that actually before I jump in, but I will just say what you're saying is kind of where I was planning to go with this. I've been thinking a lot because I can see, for example, business assets in the PSID. So there's the trade-offs between the like richness of data that I get from PSID with all the downsides that you mentioned. And I hadn't thought about using earnings, but that is something I could do. But one of the points of what I was trying to do, and I hadn't gotten this far along, was to sort of use the framework of unemployment as sort of a starting point, and then sort of think about how it maps onto alternative measures that include some of these other things like assets. And now I'm thinking about earnings. So thank you. But Frank, I'd love to hear what you have to say.
Yes, thank you for your great presentations. This is really interesting and important research, both of you. I have some comments for both of you. I'll start with Rachel. And some of this is similar to what Brian said. So there's this interesting tension between the state level unemployment rate you're using and the individual's own prior unemployment before becoming self-employed. And so I think this positive coefficient of the interaction term you have in your regression, some of this is driven by Black workers being more likely to be unemployed when the unemployment rate is high. So maybe you can make this result, which is interesting, more precise. You could maybe use a Barnard type of decomposition to show, okay, how much of this entry rate into self-employment by race is driven by the higher likelihood of being unemployed for the individual versus a larger effect of being pushed into self-employment when you are unemployed, right? So this endowment versus coefficient effect. So I have a paper where I decompose entry rate into self-employment in a recession versus in a boom period. And but they don't distinguish between black and white workers. So this could be maybe something you could consider. So looking at earnings in addition would also, of course, be very interesting. So one thing you have to take into account there, though, is that for self-employed individuals, that's sort of difficult because typically you start with the low earnings and only over the years your earnings increase. And a lot of self-employment spades are very short. So they never get into the area where their earnings become higher, even though they may have had a really good business idea, but it's just natural to start with low earnings. You have to invest in the beginning. So that's something to take into account there. For Ofronama, I have only a little comment. So in the beginning, you showed these interesting bar charts where you compare earnings in these different alternative arrangements. And there, I think you're showing a weekly earnings. And some of these earnings don't look so terrible, but it doesn't take into account that in some of these arrangements, workers work a lot of hours. And they, for example, independent contractors, and they're usually not able to bill all these hours. So if you also observe work hours or usual work hours, something like that, you could divide weekly earnings by weekly hours and then compare weekly earnings. And that may give quite a different picture. You could show hourly earnings, and it may change the picture somewhat.
Excellent. Did you guys want to respond, or I give you an opportunity? Okay, I have a couple thoughts and maybe questions. Again, these are great papers. So I guess maybe for Rachel, I had some thoughts that maybe build on what Pat was saying about potential data sets, and then also maybe related to what Frank was just saying. I don't know if this is like better or different as far as data goes, but it's not getting you at the individual level. But I was just thinking, shock wise, reminds me of work by Liz Ananat and Anna Gassman-Pines, who were unfortunately not able to make it today, thinking about their work with job loss shocks to communities, right? And thinking of that, the community-wide shock as more of a sort of exogenous shock than individual unemployment. And so, for example, their work uses North Carolina data because North Carolina has these detailed county level job loss recordings, right? So they'll say like, oh, the Pillow Tech company closed down in this county, right? And all of these jobs are lost, and over time. And so this would be county level and not individual level. But I'm wondering then if also you can, match that with some sort of county level data on self-employment or things like that. And then, just maybe thinking about, I don't know. I'm just wondering if that is, maybe it wouldn't be, the alternative, but it would be maybe additional evidence showing support for what you're trying to do. The other thought that was interesting when you show the graph relating unemployment rate to necessity entrepreneurship by race, and we had the different thresholds, it appeared, right? Different thresholds for white workers and for Black workers. I wonder if it would be interesting to do sort of a threshold analysis in this notion. I think this is I'm not sure if this might have been something that Brian and Frank were already saying, but that, this notion that for Black workers, this, 8% unemployment is not unusual historically, right? And then for white workers, it's like, oh no, right? The sky is falling. We have to fix what's wrong with the economy if they reach that level, right? And so it may be that, it's not until in my community unemployment gets to this much higher threshold that things become activated, right? In that sense. So I don't know if maybe a threshold analysis would be useful. So, I can keep talking. I have, unless you wanted to say anything or. Okay. And then I did have some thoughts for Ofronama, and now they just completely left my brain. So I'll take a pause and breathe. And if anyone else has comments, again, now the chat is enabled. I think when I initially said, please feel free to use the chat, it was not enabled, and our wonderful tech support quickly alerted me to that fact and enabled it. So if you'd like to ask questions in the chat, please do that as well. Otherwise, also please feel free to raise your hand or just unmute and speak. Okay, I remembered. See, we only needed to take a beat for me to remember what I was going to say. I was curious about, this is for Ofronama, curious about the construction of who is sort of educationally, qualified for a particular occupation. And I think I missed it initially. And so I appreciate Brian sort of reiterating that that it's sort of a little endogenous, right? This notion that it's, you are educationally qualified if you fall into this range of the people who are in that distribution. And just thinking of maybe some of the, like, I don't know, degree inflation or credentialing inflation literature, and how some of that may be definitely be endogenous to power structures, and how barriers are placed in particular occupations or jobs within those occupations. I wonder if that then affects, right, this analysis of your variable, you're crowding in or crowding out, right? Which is why I think the alternative that Brian proposed maybe does get around that possibility that, oh, this position is, has more perks, has more benefits. As people sort of leave this position, we will now say, well, in the past, this only required a high school degree, but now it requires a college degree, right? When it's the same work, right? And so, I guess maybe just thinking through to what extent is education used as a way to create barriers that crowd out particular populations.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I guess one thought I have is that that range of who is in the occupation, I feel like it's wide enough to hopefully, or broad enough to get at, covering some of the things or concerns that you have about some type of gatekeeping of who's in the role to begin with. That's between the 20th and 80th percentile of who's in it. I mean, BLS has these surveys where employers say, what education is required for this role? And that's another thing that I suppose could be tried that's also subjective, which I haven't looked at. I definitely want to give Brian's suggestion some more thought. And I totally hear you about, educational inflation. I guess I would say that the or saying that roles require this when they really don't, and someone who doesn't have the education doesn't need it. I guess since the focus is really on looking at disparities between groups within the same education, I guess that's less of a concern of mine, because again, so much of the response when we see labor market disparities between Black and white workers as well, it's because they have less education. And so, you know, my focus is on, well, let's look at people who are in the same equivalent qualifications, and now we can see that these disparities exist, and if so, I think the most reasonable explanation for that is discrimination. But you know, I definitely appreciate that comment, and we'll definitely give it some more thought on Brian's suggestion as well. Thank you.
Rachel.
When Dania mentioned the point about gatekeeping, one of the things that came to mind for me was ban the box. I wonder if you could use some of the like recent changes in policies that prevent folks from requiring disclosure about you know, past interactions with the carceral system, whether or not that has any impact on the crowding. Like perhaps that was sort of a barrier that did some of this work in some respects, like crowded people out of certain kinds of jobs. That was just one potential like exogenous-y thing that came to mind as she was talking. So I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, it's not something I have thought about. Can you give me an idea of, yeah, tell me more about what you think the relationship would be?
Yeah, I guess I was just thinking that that maybe some other types of employment opportunities might not have been open to people who have criminal justice backgrounds, and it might contribute to some of the crowding into less desirable occupations. And so I'd be curious to see if before and after, since they happened more, I think it's like New York State, for example, is one location that has done some stuff around this. So maybe there's even some like spatial discontinuity kind of a thing that you could do like within the New York MSA. You know, people in New York State have this relief. Do you see sort of within an MSA place, you know, across, I don't know, across borders, differences in crowding? I don't know if you could have the sample size, but if there's other jurisdictions that also did it, then maybe you could use timing of places that passed this ban the box stuff and maybe see if there were you know, lower or some of the crowding, you know, decreases, to see if maybe Brian just put a paper in the chat. Jurisdiction specific policies, yeah.
Excellent. Okay. Any other thoughts, questions?
Yeah, I'll definitely look into that. You know, I can't help but bring to mind the audit studies that show that even when you compare someone who's white with a criminal record to someone who's Black without and college educated, that there's still these disparities in who's able to get a foot in the door, get called back for jobs. That kind of comes to mind as I think about that too.
The things I like about those kinds of studies, I think there's information whatever you find. So like, you know, one of the hopes with these studies is that it will open opportunity, or those kinds of policies is that we think criminal, you know, having to disclose criminal record is something that is preventing people from having labor market opportunities. If, you know, you find that you don't see much of a change when this happens, I think that's still information from a policy. This would be like a completely different paper that I am proposing. I'm not suggesting that it would go with this current analysis. I'm just giving you more work to do later, potentially.
Thanks.
But if no one had anything else, I did want to go back and ask for Brian and Frank. I've been thinking about your comments around Yeah, there is this kind of, and I think it sort of motivated one of the reasons I think I struggle a little bit with this too, why I was thinking about like my original abstract for this paper actually talked about, I was hoping to get to seeing alternative measures of opportunity and necessity using some of the variables that I have available in the PSID. And I think some of that is, I do struggle a little bit with this kind of thinking about embedding in the measure itself unemployment, when it's also the thing that would be causing the necessity of entrepreneurship. And so this is more of like a conceptual philosophical question of even how to think about this dichotomy, which I didn't get into at all. And so one is the nature of, I guess, the difficulty in untangling. And I think the decomposition suggestion makes sense. Sort of the effect of being pushed by the unemployment, like the local or whatever your jurisdiction is, unemployment rates that gets at, potentially demand for your labor, versus when it actually affects you. Still a little bit fuzzy. This isn't a fully formed question, but I'm curious if you all had more thoughts on that. And then my other question was going to be about, in some other like disciplines, not economics as much, that talk about opportunity and necessity entrepreneurship, I think they are less committed to the idea of them being there being this dichotomous split, and the extent to which people sort of find or create opportunities out of necessity. And I'm particularly curious about this with respect to things like innovation, and how necessity might, there's sort of just a colloquial saying, necessity is the mother of invention, how we might think about, necessity or negative labor markets as sort of providing opportunities or people being more potentially likely to recognize an opportunity because now they've actually got time and space where they have to think about an alternative form of work. So I was wondering what you thought, what thoughts you all might have about that as well, and how those kinds of opportunities might also differ along racial lines.
Yeah, maybe I respond to that. So this distinction, necessity versus opportunity entrepreneurs, when you use prior labor market status for the distinction, I think this is very useful for describing the data. So mostly for descriptive statistics and showing the differences. And when you want to do a more causal regression, then one alternative is, so similar to what I said before, that you put individual unemployment on the right-hand side of the regression as an explanatory factor, and then see how that influences entry into self-employment. And then you can distinguish by race and see, and then again say, explore how much is explained by the higher unemployment rate of Black workers. And apart from that, are Black workers who are unemployed, do they have a higher likelihood to move into self-employment? And then the other point you mentioned, help me out, what was the second?
Just thinking about the extent to which the two, opportunity and necessity, might not necessarily be sort of mutually exclusive.
Yes, right, and you're absolutely right. So a lot of entrepreneurs who come out of unemployment, they are very successful, and some have really good business ideas, and their businesses grow. So it's not at all should this distinction be understood like necessity entrepreneurship is useless, or those who come out of unemployment, they shouldn't be supported because they're not going to be successful. Not at all. So this is just to get at this huge heterogeneity you have in self-employment. So it's one step toward not treating them all the same, and to look at where the motivations are very different for people. Some people would like to be a paid employee, but they couldn't find a job, and so they becoming self-employed instead. So one virtue of this distinction is, for example, looking what is success of self-employment. And you could often, when you measure success, you say, okay, survival in self-employment is success. But some people may really want to have a more stable paid employment position. So if they move from self-employment to paid employment, for example, that could be a success. And to see this and assess this right, it makes sense to look at, okay, where they're coming from, what are the motivations for different types of self-employed people.
And the only other thing I would add to that is, with the PSID or those longitudinal data sets, you could measure volatility of earnings. You could measure earnings growth. Excuse me. And so both those strike me as like interesting outcomes to look at as well.
Excellent. So any other thoughts, questions? This is great. I'm glad we were able to actually spend a good amount of time on your papers. So I guess with that, I will say thank you again for attending. Thank you to Lyra for sponsoring this session. Please do check out all of the other Lyra sessions that are ongoing and amazing during ASSA 2022. And that is all. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dania. Thanks. Nice to meet everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.